In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the compromises that were made at what became known as the Constitutional Convention. I mentioned in the last lesson that delegates from all the 13 states, sat down to fix the Articles of Confederation, our first national government. It didn't take them all that long to figure out that it would be a better idea to put the Articles of Confederation aside and try and draft a new government essentially from scratch. And so this gathering became known as the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution itself is nicknamed a bundle of compromises because you have delegates from 13 very different states. You had agricultural states, you had manufacturing and trade states, you had states where slavery was legal and slaves were a significant percentage of the population, to states where slavery was illegal or slaves were an insignificant percentage of the population. So the delegates came together, and the plan was ultimately to draft a new government, but certainly they wanted to represent their states and get as much for their states as they could. That's going to lead to the necessity of compromise, where nobody walks away with everything they want, but they give up a little bit of what they want to get some of what they want. The essence of compromise. The Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise, is a prime example of this. Here you have the state of Virginia, which was the largest state by population at the time, insisting that it should have a larger share in the lawmaking process and the legislative process because it has the largest population of the 13 states. The state of New Jersey had the smallest population at the time and made the argument that even though it had a less of a population than Virginia did, it was a state just as Virginia was and should have the same say or equal say in the lawmaking process with Virginia and the other 11 states. So what both were looking for was a one-house legislature or unicameral legislature, all right, based on their ideas. Virginia's was what we would call proportional representation. New Jersey's was equal representation. And the result you see in front of you was the decision to, instead of having a unicameral legislature, to have a bicameral legislature or two-house Congress. And that is what we have today. We have the Senate, which was essentially New Jersey's idea, equal representation per state. There are 2 senators per state, and the House of Representatives, which was Virginia's idea of proportional representation, representation based on population. So larger populated states have more representatives in the House than lesser populated states do. Now, once they got over that hump, and that took some time, they immediately encountered another problem and the necessity of another compromise. All right, southern states wanted their slave populations counted, 1 for 1 as part of the total population, and the northern states countered that that should not be the case. Let me back this up a second. The Southerners had always referred to their slaves as property. Now, all of a sudden, because it's convenient for them to do so, they want to count them as people for the population total. So, the solution here was a rather twisted solution, or convoluted solution, known as the 3/5 compromise. The decision was made to count the white population and then count the slave population separately and take 3/5 or 60% of the slave population and add it to the white population total to come up with a total population number. This was only used to determine representation in the House of Representatives. That's the only reason these figures were used. All right, as well as you see here, issues of taxation, but don't worry about that for now. A major flaw in the Articles of Confederation government that people recognized quickly on was the fact that the national government did not have the power to regulate interstate commerce or business between states, goods crossing state lines. So everyone at the convention recognized the need for the national government to have that power, and the Congress would be given this power to regulate interstate trade. But folks also recognized that the slave trade was interstate trade, and thus potentially could come under the control or regulation of Congress. Southerners certainly did not want that to happen. So you see here the compromise that was made, tying these two issues together, that the compromise on commerce and slave trade would give Congress the power it really did need to regulate interstate trade. However, the issue of slavery was something was off limits to Congress for 20 years. That was the compromise that was made in order for Congress to have the power to regulate interstate trade. So here, 2 out of 3 of the major compromises that were made at the convention have something to do with slavery, which does give us a sense of the idea that slavery really was a problem, a somewhat divisive issue early on in our nation's history. Of course, you may be aware that this issue is going to explode about 80 years in the future in 1860 with the start of the Civil War, which is going to split the nation. But that is a lesson for another day and another year. The rest of the Constitution, we're going to get into the particulars of the Constitution, talk specifically about the structure of the federal government and the powers that each of the branches has. But we're kind of going to skip to the end of the story as it relates to the convention, because once the Constitution was written, now it had to be ratified by the 13 states, specifically 9 out of the 13 states. And do not get the idea that everybody was on board with this new government that existed on paper. All right, you can see here that the Federalists were, I should phrase it this way: the people that liked what was written down on the paper, that thought that this would probably be a good government in practice, were known as the Federalists. All right, they wanted a fairly strong national government, felt that what had been drafted on paper, because remember, none of this was reality. Today we have 200 years plus of looking at how this is all played out. But at the time, for the folks living in 1787, 1788, this was all theoretical. It was all on paper. All right. So there were some folks that had concerns. All right. There were some folks that looked at what had been written down and felt that maybe the framers of the Constitution had gone a bit too far, that they had given this new national government too much power, that too much power had been taken from the states. And additionally, this is not listed on the screen, they were very upset with the fact that there was no list of the people's rights anywhere in the document. With that in mind now, I'll move this over so you can see. All right, now it had to go to the 13 state legislatures for debate and ratification. All right, and both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, in order to sway public opinion, printed material, editorials in newspapers and pamphlets and whatnot, to try and convince people that the Federalists that this was a good idea, the Anti-Federalists that the Constitution was not a good idea. As a matter of fact, there's a series of papers known as the Federalist Papers, a series of essays, I should say, known as the Federalist Papers, that were drafted to deal with a number of the criticisms and explain in more detail the structure and reason behind the structure of the federal government the way that they had done it. And again, in an attempt to win approval. It was crucial that New York and Virginia, the two most populated states at the time, ratify this. And it looked like there was a lot of anti-federalist sentiment in the New York state legislature. In other words, there was a good chance that New York might vote this down. All right, that led the framers, essentially Federalists, to cut a deal to deal with the anti-federalist biggest problem, the lack of a Bill of Rights. And the deal was simple. They said, look, we need a government right now. Right? Articles of Confederation government is not working. The nation is a mess economically and politically, and let's get this up and running, and we will sit right back down and draft a Bill of Rights. And that's exactly what happened. Eventually, all 13 states did ratify the Constitution. Of course, once the ninth state did, the government could be created, which it was in 1789. And we'll talk specifically about that in the next unit, George Washington's presidency and such. But they did sit right back down and draft the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, listing the rights of the people. So then, just to sum up, we've got the major constitutional compromises that we've looked at. The Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, which created our bicameral legislature, or two-house Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We had the Three-Fifths Compromise, which dealt with the issue of how to count the population. And as we know from this, we were going to count the 60% of the slave population and add it to the white population of each state in order to come up with a population total. And then we had the Compromise on Commerce and Slave Trade, where Congress was given the authority to regulate interstate commerce, but they couldn't touch the issue of slavery or the slave trade for 20 years. All right? In terms of ratification, folks that were upset that the Constitution did not include a list of the people's rights were known as anti-federalists, and they really did almost get the upper hand, particularly in New York. So as a result, the Federalists agreed to sit right back down and draft a Bill of Rights right after the government was up and running. In the next set of lessons, we're going to take a look at what that government looked like.